All right, here we go. The annual tradition, Dick. Are you ready?
Hell yeah.
A tradition like no other. The day after podcast, complete with I don't know if it's an alcohol hangover, but it's definitely a hangover of some kind.
Definitely.
The conference hangover.
After the conference hangover, 3 days of back-to-back meetings, you're sort of a little bit groggy, but that's why it's good to take a step back and just reflect on what we've done for the last few days.
The ASUG annual conference / Sapphire Now is in the books. You and I had largely different schedules, so
which is good.
So we can compare notes. Now, we haven't really prepped this at all, and we don't know what either one of us is going to say. So
surprise, surprise.
Yeah. All we know is that you have to leave for the airport in a little bit. So we'll get this nailed down and then send you on your merry way. So what are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, I liked this conference. It was much more upbeat in terms of sort of just the vibe. I think that was in comparison to the last few Sapphires. I think you noticed that, especially on the keynotes of day 2, where everything sort of fit together in terms of the 3 individuals speaking, and each one had their own message. And I really liked Bernd's presentation, which was the middle one, which was sort of a combination of sort of S4 in terms of the context of the entire SAP landscape. That was really good. And then just jumping around a bit here, and then I really, on day 3 was Hassel's keynote, was the very long demo about S4 migration tools, and that was very useful as well. But I liked it.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting because the day 1 keynote ran long and seemed very overwrought, and and what was so interesting about day 2 is that they didn't seem like they tried nearly as hard. I mean, as far as let's just have the best keynote ever. It was more well, let's bring out a customer and talk with them. And it was sort of interesting because when you take a look at that, you realize that SAP has enough good things to offer right now. They don't have to dress it up too much, just be direct. And what was interesting was I thought Steve Singh's keynote was pretty important. This was, SAP has been trying for years to get someone from one of these SaaS acquisitions to stick to the wall in a leadership capacity. And it looks like maybe they finally have the guy. And I don't know what your opinion was, but my feeling was that was the most coherent view. SAP's been saying we're a cloud company for a long time, but to me, that was the most coherent view of we get the cloud business model.
Well, I mean, he gets it. Because he comes from Concur. He has the whole experience. I don't know how far other aspects of SAP also share that vision, but he definitely has it. And just based on his experience.
Yeah, and it seemed important because one of the big themes of the conference I thought was integration, right? Which is funny because it's a business conference, but it's become very clear. And that was even brought up in the first day keynote, was that CIOs and such are pushing back on SAP and saying we need roadmaps and we need better integration with S4 and many other components. And I thought Steve Singh really addressed that from a cloud perspective, obviously, but talking about everything from microservices to APIs, because SAP, let's be honest, they haven't really had an API culture, and they clearly
they have the enterprise services repository, that ISOA sort of a thing.
But in the press QA, Bernd Leichert basically admitted, he said you needed a PhD to work with some of our BAPIs.
The question is, and we're sort of jumping around here. The question is, how can they avoid repeating the mistakes from the past? I think that's going to be a challenge. I like the vision, and you're right. API, this is a business conference, but API, that word kept on being used in terms of the announcement of the API hub. So that was intriguing. But of course, the question is going to be, these are customers who have been with SAP for a while, and they know the history. And so they can say, okay, what are you going to do this time to avoid the problems that you had in the past? And that's going to be interesting to watch.
Yeah, it's like I tried NetWeaver middleware. That didn't work out so good for me, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. I think for SAP, the advantage is, working off of Apogee's tool set and such. They're working with a company that really knows modern APIs a lot better than the stuff they've had before. But as you point out, you still have to realize that, and you have to persuade customers who've been down the path a few times to say, "Whoa, let's go down this path again."
And if you looked at Bernd's keynote, there's one section where he had sort of this graphical representation of all the APIs that are coming. And I mean, I think they have a good idea. The question is, when are these APIs coming? And will there be the APIs which customers really need? And that was one thing that they described, was that they will bring APIs out based on customer demand, which is useful. I mean, because they have all this domain knowledge, and to push all these APIs out at once is impossible. So I think what they're going to do is they're going to say, okay, if we have a customer that needs the transportation APIs, then those will be pushed out.
Right.
So it'll be in sort of a agile methodology that they will bring out the APIs as they're needed, rather than trying to have this concerted effort where everything comes out, which would never be successful.
And just to be clear, the whole thing around this is that so there's this whole debate in the IT industry around digital transformation, and basically it's pretty commonly accepted that most industries are being impacted by digital business models in some way, whether they're being quote unquote disrupted immediately or whether there's change down the pike. And it's not just that a competitor might be coming for you. It's the idea that maybe, for example, the data that you have could be turned into a different type of business or service, right? And so companies are saying, well, what do we need to get there? And a lot of analyst firms and cloud companies talk about various versions of bimodal IT, which is basically leave your old ERP legacy investments alone and just start purchasing customer-facing cloud stuff. And kind of the core just ends up withering away as you start adding more and more cloud pieces. What SAP is trying to present is a different model, which is S/4HANA is your real-time enterprise digital core. Right. And yeah, it might be a little difficult for some of you guys to move there. But once you're there, you're going to be able to do all this cool stuff. And so I've been very interested to see, how are customers going to respond to this approach? And for the most part, my impression is that customers kind of like what SAP is presenting. But what they are saying, amongst other things, is we need skills, support, roadmaps, migration, and they want the digital core to integrate easily with other stuff. So this is where the API piece and the HANA Cloud Platform piece fit into the picture, right? They want to be able to say, maybe it's an SAP Cloud product, maybe it's Salesforce or Workday or whatever it is. They want to be able to plug that in to their so-called digital core. And so I think for SAP to succeed on the digital core, they have to take one last great swing at this integration issue and get it right.
Right. I mean, because they have all these acquired products now. Okay. And the customers are they're already starting to purchase multiple cloud products. Okay. And so these things don't work in isolation. And as we all know, integration in the cloud is just difficult. And for SAP to sort of realize that they can help customers by either creating content now and testing it so it's available, or pressuring partners to do it, I think it's just the realization that's what customers demand.
I think the other interesting tension around a conference like this is getting people excited about stuff, but also being clear with people around and customers around when things are actually happening. So your API thing's a good example, right? Like, we're doing all this stuff, but when are we actually going to have them? Another great example, that was the SAP iOS announcement, which happened the week before the conference and got a lot of press coverage. But I felt the coverage was a little bit off, and then a little premature. And then at the event, we find out that actually the SDK to build this stuff isn't actually coming till the end of the year. So now it does look, when we were sitting with a partner, you and I were in that meeting together, we had a partner in there who's saying, I build this stuff all the time, and this SDK is really going to help me, and he gave all these reasons why it would going to be great for him for building. So that's great, but it's not coming till the end of the year. So it's like, well, how do you go from announcing this cool thing you're excited about to also being clear with people around what to expect? Because I don't think you want to put customers in the position of constantly doing homework on when this stuff's actually going to be available. Like you and I, we have the time and energy to chase down those details. What about everybody else? So anyway, it's sort of interesting.
So I want to talk about S4. Because that was one of the main focus points of this conference. And I think it's getting a lot cleaner in terms of what the strategy is. I mean, I think we had lots of meetings with either customers who have moved to S4 or people who are involved in the S4 effort within SAP. And I mean, what was interesting for me was talking to the customers who have S4. And I talked to two customers, and they were both small customers. I mean, they weren't these huge businesses. And that was maybe an interesting realization that S4 isn't for everybody. That there are some customers, for example, who will have, I mean, it's not the S4 on premise, some will be S4 on the cloud, but there'll be this huge variety. And I think that was interesting.
Right. So obviously SAP is mostly focused on large enterprise customers with S4. And the main reason for that is strictly numbers, right? SAP is trying to hit numbers around S4. But if a smaller, medium-sized company finds out about S4 and asks for it, they're going to get it.
Right. I mean,
so
except maybe perhaps the very smallest customers might not be appropriate for S4, but the companies. I mean, we were talking to a startup from Korea, and they had moved to S4 Finance, and they were totally happy. And so that was, I mean, an interesting idea that startups could be using this as well, not just the largest companies. And I think it's also a lot cleaner now in terms of what companies are really going to be moving to the public cloud. I mean, there was one, I think, Q&A with Hasa, who said, we really can't expect the largest companies to be moving their ERPs to the public cloud. They're going to be on premise. And I mean, that's just reality.
There was a very interesting thing that went down around the S4 finance piece, because SAP, the origins of this around simple finance were basically like, well, the internal debate is how long do we support a finance only component to S4? Right. So that was very interesting because we were going to press with an article, and I was trying to dig out the final confirmation on that. And basically what it comes down to from SAP right now, confirmed with Sven Deniken, was that they are releasing another update to the finance one this month. Right. But that's the last one they've formally committed to at this time. Okay. But they might continue to do it. They aren't saying no. What they're trying to do is strike the balance there, because it turns out the customers like, at least for now, they like the finance step. And there's a couple reasons for that. One of it is that the functionality for enterprise management is still being fleshed out across the other areas. Right. But also, it's perhaps a stepping stone, and a stepping stone to start moving both technically and a business model type towards this new way of doing business with SAP. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, because it does get tricky for SAP to explain the different releases and tracks, and it might be clear to you, but I'm not sure that if you asked a customer to explain the differences between the HANA Enterprise Cloud version and the private cloud and the public, whether they would be able to do that. But it does seem like SAP is getting clear around why they need each type of release, right? Right. I mean, we also had an interesting discussion regarding having parts of S4 on the public cloud and parts on premise, and how would that work? Because people, probably won't move everything. If they decided to move to the public cloud, they're not going to move everything at once. So they would move parts to the public cloud, and then parts would remain on premise, and how that would work. And it was because you have to remember that the public cloud has a different release cycle than the on-premise stuff. Right. But the public is 4 times a year. Right. And on-premise is once a year. Right. So, you would think that there would be a difference, but because of the APIs, and the API, of course, you have to be backwards compatible. So you could probably keep the two systems integrated, which is an interesting idea. Actually, I seem to recall you getting into an argument with someone at SAP about that this week, because they were saying it's all one code line, and you were saying, well, not quite, because one code line's getting a little bit ahead of the other, but that's why the APIs are so important. Right. And if you have the APIs are valid and they're backward compatible, then it would still work. Right. But I know it makes things more complicated, but I think that's how the real world is. Yeah. So I know Matthias Steiner's probably listening to this podcast because he was asking about it yesterday. Do you have any love for the HANA Cloud Platform? Yeah, the one announcement that wasn't maybe pushed as much as it should have been was the whole the Cloud Foundry beta. Right.
which came out, I think on Monday before the Sapphire started, and that's very important. And I think what's important is that it really provides SAP sort of a stamp of approval for a standardized developer experience on HCP, which is, I mean, of course they have their own APIs, they have their own command line interface, but with the CF foundation work with the CF work within HCP, now they can bring in other developers as well. I mean, and HCP is also the basis of other platforms as a service, and it'll be a lot easier for people to move back and forth if they decide to move to that platform. And it's also, I mean, interesting for customers, in case customers want to have it in their data center, which is probably going to happen at some point, I assume.
Right. And I got into an interesting conversation with Matthias around this because I was basically asking, well, if you're providing all this through Cloud Foundry, then what is the point of the HANA Cloud Platform at all? Like if you're essentially working on a different platform. But what he was saying is that even through Cloud Foundry, you're going to be able to access all of the HCP services. So what you're essentially doing is, by giving developers Cloud Foundry access, what you're essentially saying to them is, if I'm an open source developer, I'm used to working in open source environments. You're essentially formally supporting that.
Right.
So they're probably going to be more likely to be willing to give this a go than trying a proprietary platform, even if it's the same languages they've always used.
Right. I mean, and because if you take a look at Cloud Foundry, I mean, it's the foundation, but if you look at other platform as a services that are based on Cloud Foundry, Bluemix, for example, they also have their own services. If everything was the same, then there wouldn't be a reason for people to do it. But it's a foundation, and it's a commonality across all these different platforms, which makes it so interesting.
Yeah, and there was a fair amount of HANA Cloud Platform talk from the main stage as well. Given that this is a business conference, it was sort of interesting to hear a fair amount about that. Do you think that? How do you see that working for customers? Are they going to be thinking about? Because right now, I don't think there's a whole lot going on with S/4HANA and HCP in terms of extending.
Right, I know it's possible, and I think some of the APIs which will be coming out in the API Hub are from S4. Mm-hmm. So that's, I mean, an important step. But the question is, are there really extensions which are out there from partners? Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, for a customer, I mean, HCP is always how you extend existing applications. I mean, there's these three types of applications that they want to really push. But you got to get partners to have their applications for their extensions running on HCP. And I think there's the one, I think what's the application partner center or something. There's so many stores from SAP. So there are applications there, but I don't know how much effort is going in from SAP to really push those out to the customer.
Well, the one thing we can definitely confirm from this week is that S/4HANA is using HCP as their extension plot. That is the go-to strategy. Right. So if you're a customer listening to this, you definitely want to think about that, because going forward, SAP is going to really be pushing you away from customization. Right. And and so you're going to need to start thinking about, I need to understand, either through a partner or through my own internal IT, how to develop on the HANA Cloud Platform. And extend my functionality in cases where I need something perhaps industry specific that I can't get elsewhere. Right.
And what's important is that although the emphasis for these extensions are on public cloud S4 installations, it's exact the same situation for on-premise installations as well. Because I mean, they're moving away from customization to configuration. Mm-hmm. I mean, and that was what's interesting. If you look at the one demo that we had, the one tooling demo that we had on day 3 in Hasso's keynote, I mean, that was a very long demo where they basically took a customer through the migration from a non-S4 environment to an S4 environment. And it looked, of course, really easy. It's not probably as easy for most customers, but it was the fact that it was, first of all, it's a cloud-based tool, which I thought was very interesting. And just the fact that it goes through and analyzes your system and helps you make the moves. And it would show you basically what customization would be a potential issue. Of course, the question is, what happens when you realize that? How do you move the customization to HCP? And that's still open.
that's still an open question.
Right.
So I think it's really more about starting to understand that is the forward strategy and start to think about how you're going to work on that. You might not be doing it next month or even next 6 months, but it's going to come down. The other piece of it that, as far as new skills, was talking around the iOS stuff. The controversy going into the conference was, does this mean SAP's backing off of UI5 and Fiori? And it's very clear, talking to everyone from San Mien, who owns Fiori, to everyone else, that they're not backing down from that at all.
Right.
But what they are acknowledging is that device-based development has become important. It's become very clear that there's advantages to that, whether it's GPS location and taking advantage of, or maybe it's stuff on the phone like Gmail integration or email or whatever it is. And so that's essentially what they're trying to do. But the problem being that for an SAP developer, if they don't know Swift, they're not going to be able to develop in those environments. So that's the other sort of wake-up call here is, you're thinking about going forward with these types of apps. You're going to have to start thinking about how your SAP and your iOS teams can work together on this stuff.
Right.
There's a little bit of planning. You probably have some Swift resources somewhere. Now you got to figure out how to make those groups talk to each other and get along a little better.
Right. I mean, there's one topic that I missed. That was the Microsoft announcement.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, and it was interesting that most of the content, there's a pretty big announcement. Most of the integration was based on Outlook in Office 365, which is, I mean, I thought it was really interesting, especially between, for example, SuccessFactors and Outlook, in terms of making, if you do a vacation request, then it goes and looks in your Outlook calendar and says, you have these conflicts, please reschedule, things like that. So, I mean, it's an interesting idea that it's moving beyond just the Duet-based sort of integration to a much higher level.
Wow, you used the word duet. Wow.
Yeah, I know.
So, someone from
showing my age.
Someone from SAP is like shaking in shame and sadness right now over whatever happened to Duet. But
yeah, I mean, what's also interesting is that integration, I think, goes via HCP.
Yeah. And there were a wide spectrum of responses on the Microsoft. I mean, Dennis was like, yeah, whatever. And but Harold Ryder from Emphasis, he's excited about it. He claims that he has customers who are really, like, especially things like the 365 integration. He sees that as a pretty big step forward.
Right.
But I thought it was interesting because, when they announced the SAP iOS thing before the conference, I was trying to understand why they did that instead of saving it. And then when they had the big Microsoft Fest on the first day, I was like, well, maybe that has something to do with it as well. Because Apple and Microsoft on the same stage gets a little awkward sometimes. They have a lot of history.
But I mean, I think, what's important is that we're seeing it more often is that SAP is partnering with other large vendors. I mean, it could be with HCP in the HCP space, or in IoT, or with Microsoft. I mean, I think that's a very wise move. I mean, they can't do everything, and they should just focus on their strengths and just bring in other people who can complement those.
Yeah. All right. So did you learn anything else? I think we covered most of the news announcements.
Well, I mean, we could also do the one digital consumer insight.
Oh, yes. Becker's, Jonathan Becker's digital project. Yeah.
That was, I mean, we haven't talked about it yet, but that was interesting. I mean,
well, it was a seriously interesting endeavor. And by the way, I got a little bit of updated information on, because you were saying some of this technology existed before.
Yeah.
I think it was an enterprise focused thing that they did before.
It is. Yeah.
This one is not necessarily enterprise focused. It's priced around the digital.
Right.
And essentially, it's not even a digital app; it's a digital service.
Right.
But to be clear for listeners who don't know about it yet, SAP, through its Sybase acquisition, has access to a tremendous amount of mobile data on you and me and a lot of other people.
Right.
And they've
anonymized.
They figured out a way to aggregate that data and anonymize it. And because they're the only company that has access to almost all of this data.
97%, I think, of telecoms use it.
It gives them the ability to pinpoint a lot of very interesting geolocational questions. For example, and during our demo, Jonathan's showing us we wanted to compare foot traffic between the Apple Store in Manhattan and the Apple Store in San Francisco. But in real time or near real time, in just a couple of minutes, we had that information at our fingertips. And essentially, you can order that as a service off of the SAP store. Super interesting. I mean, it reminds you of, I think someone said, and I think they were right, this is what Vishal kind of wanted all along for HANA is these types of services that immediately make sense to a business person. I don't need to know that it's powered by HANA or, all I know is that this is super useful information that can help me.
Price point that I can afford.
Yeah. Right.
Without sales staff, without having to do a 50-page document,
without migration tools, I can just get to work. I mean, to me, that's the essence of digital. I mean, maybe over time you do want a digital core. We could have a long discussion about the pros and cons of investing in that, but the immediate bang is I got to open a new store next week. Did I pick the right location or whatever it is? So that was super interesting, and it didn't get. It was. I thought it was going to get some keynote love on the last day, but it didn't so much.
Unfortunately, not.
But they may have ran out of time for whatever reason. But it is on the SAP store if people want to check it out. So, but that was really interesting. And someone told me, "Oh, I don't think it'll succeed because SAP is not going to push it." So we'll see if that's the case or not. I mean,
there's a new division dealing with data as a service. So, from Helen Arnold. So it's not like they're just going to ignore it. I mean, this is going to be just the initial push in this area.
Well, also Jonathan Becker, he does know a thing or two about marketing. So I seriously doubt he would create, one of the coolest products he's probably ever created in his career and then just let it sit around and, the store and have his fingers crossed. I mean, he's going to try to figure out what to do about it. And he did get a lot of media attention this week. So he probably has already figured out something about that. So that was super interesting.
I also had two interesting meetings with the Hybris and with the Ariba president, or the people who are responsible for those business units. Fascinating. Smart guys. They have some really good ideas in terms of what they're going to do for their particular area. And I really enjoyed the conversations I had with them.
Yeah, the customer experience part is SAP is fun there because they make these self-serving statements about CRM being dead, which is really convenient when you're getting your ass kicked in CRM by Salesforce. But I think there is some point to what they're saying, which is that the whole way we think about relating to customers is different now than it used to be. Thinking about it in terms of like contact centers and call centers and, service calls and things like that. That's if it doesn't feed into a broader relationship of some kind, it doesn't make sense. And Hybris perhaps is a key part of the new customer experience for SAP.
Right. What we didn't see were any chatbots.
We didn't see any chatbots, and we didn't see a whole lot of AI, did we?
No.
There was some references to it.
Right.
There was some lip service paid.
Right. That into machine learning, but that's what the new buzzword. So you always got to mention those.
Yeah, they mentioned them, but I didn't see a whole lot. But maybe by Tech Ed they'll be ready to rock and roll on that.
Right.
Yeah, I think it was a fairly solid show for SAP. The one thing I would say is that I think customers are still looking for more evidence that other big customers are making the S/4HANA move and that they'll follow along with that, because when you talk a lot of the S/4HANA videos we did, a lot of them were with slightly unconventional situations. Right. Not a classic core SAP customer.
Yeah.
But we did get a couple of those as well. So it's starting to happen. Right. But I think they also want to feel like it can happen in a situation where, like you get a Nestle or whatever and it's super cool, but like they have such a strong relationship, they're picking up the phone with SAP. I might not have that level of relationship. Right. So I need to feel like I can make that move without going there.
What was the one program that Bill McDermott described in the first day, what, value assurance, or what's the name of that?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that was important. That was the one really program where they want to make sure that the S4 implementation projects are successful and on budget and based on certain standards. And I thought it was useful. I mean, important for customers to take a look at that and say, okay, these are certain standards that they're going to follow to make sure that the sins of the past aren't repeated.
And the final piece to that is that I did a video on the first day with Jeff Scott, CEO of ASUG, and obviously the ASUG people feel strongly and correctly that there's a whole different aspect of this conference. Part of it is just user education, and part of it is the ASUG voice. And what Jeff had done super interesting was collaborated with DSAG and managed to come out with a combined position paper on digital.
Oh, really? I haven't seen that.
They came out with a combined position paper on digital transformation, and also how SAP's products fit into that. And that is a really good vantage point for understanding, because if you're a customer, I would argue that you need to start by thinking about, what does digital mean in my industry?
Right.
How am I going to deal with it? And then you start figuring out how the SAP product portfolio might fit into that. And so for ASUG and DSAG to get on the same page,
I mean, it's pretty amazing
on just about anything, but especially digital, because especially DSAG in the past, they've definitely been a little bit of a pushback on digital hype. They're, these are like solid German dudes and dudettes, right? They don't, they've seen a lot of things come and go. They're not going to hop on the digital bandwagon for no reason. So the thing I got from the report that was useful and the interview with Jeff, was that there is this fundamental acknowledgement that industries are changing, and that customers need to think about that, and they're going to push their users a little bit to think about that. But then they also went through what are some of the challenges, everything from talent to business model change, and how customers should think about that, and then ultimately what SAP should be doing. And I think the good news for SAP is that these user groups have pretty much said, they haven't said, oh, you're totally on the wrong track here. What they have said is that we need a lot more help getting there in a variety of ways. So I was talking with someone from SAP last night, and they were asking, how do we do? And I said, I thought you did pretty well, because honestly, I'm surprised by how many customers have bought into your digital core message. It's more than I would have expected. But then I also said, you have to find a way to buy time on Wall Street for a couple of years, because this is not going to kick in overnight. And the Wall Street investor crowd and the financial analysts, they don't really understand what SAP is doing in the sense of like, oh, this is a good bet, let's just hang out and wait for this to come around. They're still looking at, are you a cloud company? And they're evaluating based on SaaS valuations, which is how they've approached the enterprise for a number of years now. They prize growth over profits, and they've made that clear. So how do you manage that? How do you buy yourself enough time to make this transition? To me, that's their biggest question. So I don't know how they're going to do it, and that'll be interesting.
No, just have to wait for the next time.
I'm not a financial analyst, and I can't really advise SAP on how to handle that. I just know that SAP gets into trouble when they worry too much about those guys, but and focus too much on the short term.
It's a long-term game, definitely.
And for yourself, this is also rather interesting. I don't know how much you want to talk about this, but you yourself are getting a lot of hands-on experience in new cloud paradigms through.
I mean, right now I'm basically working on our ServiceNow team, and so I know based on my experience on a day-to-day basis that it's often not easy. I mean, I have a much better understanding now of the difficulties that can occur, and that's why I'm much more aware that SAP is in some areas is doing an excellent job. Security, in terms of data privacy from Europe and things like that, they're doing a really good job.
And in terms of your work, I assume you're learning a whole lot about service integration in a cloud level?
I mean, that's what I do. I mean, I'm dealing with the integrations for ServiceNow, and I mean, I know that it's not easy, and it's difficult, and it's just curious to see how SAP does it, and some things they do really well, and other things it's just difficult. I mean, you have a third-party application that has an API which really isn't defined, then the integration is going to be tough. But if customers need it, then you got to find a way to realize it. And I mean, we haven't mentioned the HANA Cloud integration platform yet, but that's supposed to be the go-to location for integrations, and I'm going to be curious to see what really happens there.
So officially, HCI HANA Cloud integration is part of HANA Cloud platform now.
Right.
I don't know exactly what that means other than the naming. There's been a lot of naming changes. I'm getting a little worn out right now.
Yeah, but I mean, I think what has to be important is that as we've mentioned multiple times, integration is the key here, because you have these cloud applications which have talked to one another. And if HCI has to be sort of the central point for these integrations, then SAP has to stay behind the product and really push it, not only in terms of engineering, but in terms of sales as well. And I mean, I think that's the message has to go from the top to the bottom, that this is the path forward.
Yeah, and finally, I think there's a fairly big issue helping startups and partners who are building apps on the HANA Cloud platform take these apps directly to customers, and it's a long conversation I don't really want to get into now, because I'm actually trying to work the back channel a little bit to help some of these folks out. I want to give the back channel some time before I talk about it too much, but what it comes down to is you can have all the tools in the world, but if you can't get products and apps in front of customers, then it's a little tougher. Right. And I think that's still the part that SAP is struggling with a little bit, and they need to fix it, because so a lot when it's so difficult to get an app in front of a customer and sell it to that customer in terms of things like being an approved vendor and stuff like that, what you end up having is a situation where only the top 20 or so services firms are making your apps for you, and you're missing out on a lot of interesting stuff.
Right, innovation from the smaller companies, of course.
Because there's a lot of cool startups doing everything from virtual reality stuff to cool industry-specific stuff in a particular industry where they have like hardcore lean startup. You want those people involved in your ecosystem, and I think in my mind that's something SAP has to do, and they're not there yet on that. So that's something I'm going to be watching heading into TechEd, if they can kind of make that better, because you can talk about a platform all you want, but if you can't get people to market, it's not going to work. And unfortunately, right now you can't just slap apps up on a store and get it done. If your direct sales force isn't invested in that in some way and sees the advantage of it, then it's not going to happen.
Right. I think the sales force is now very aware in terms of SAP's cloud products.
Yes.
I think that awareness is now pretty much to the whole sales force. But the thing is, all the partner apps, because those are critical as well. You need both. Yeah.
And in certain domains, it's a huge competitive advantage. I won't get into the full details, but in the HR space, I think SuccessFactors, one of their big advantages if they're up against Workday is the ability to extend on the HANA Cloud platform. Right. And you need partners to be able to build your customer something nice. Right. And the more apps you have, the more you're going to blow them away. And so you got to seize the moment. You built this platform. Right. Now, make the marketplace part of that real. Right. So anyway, that's a whole nother thing. All right. So we should probably get you on your way. Okay. Anything for TechEd? Are there any themes? TechEd's early this year. The Vegas one is like early September. Is there anything you're going to be like hoping that they move ahead on?
Just be watching HCP. What I always hoped for was that there would be sort of this explosion in terms of APIs, which would be released just based on the business services that are coming from Hybris Yas, and it hasn't occurred yet. And I don't know whether they were waiting for the API hub to get up and running or whether there are other reasons. But that's, without the business services, HCP doesn't have the competitive advantage that it should have against other platforms. Right. Because that is SAP's strength. Just the knowledge in terms of domain expertise that they've collected over the years, push it out, give it to developers, because that's what they need to make the interesting apps.
By the way, if you're from SAP and you're listening, Dick's going to want your stats. I learned this yesterday. So He's not just going to want to hear you say we got a bunch of APIs and a bunch of people using them. He's going to want to know how many APIs, how many people are using them, preferably in visual format. So you got some time to work on that. So don't find yourself in a meeting with Dick without those stats, or it might go downhill for you pretty quickly. Well, I hope the listeners got a lot out of this, despite the fact that we weren't in a quiet room. We had to settle for a relatively empty hallway, so more background noise than usual, but I'm thinking we got a pretty good cut. So
yeah, I agree.
Thanks for the time. It's always a pleasure, Dick.
Yep.
Appreciate it.
Thanks.